And he is,
I'm Derrick Day.
I got to point the other direction.
No, it's always confusing.
So today is St. Patrick's Day. So
Hi, laddie.
we're going all in. I'm mostly Scotch Irish, like Northern European. I'm the whitest dude you'll ever meet. So some people don't know this. Most people wear green on St. Patrick's Day. But the green in the flag represents the Catholic side of Ireland. And so the Protestant side is represented by the orange. So I'm wearing orange for St. Patrick's Day. Hope I don't offend any of my Irish Catholic friends out there by doing that. And I got in the glass a special cocktail. I took some Guinness stout, boiled it down with some brown sugar to make some simple syrup, and then mixed it in with some Jameson whiskey and a couple dashes of chocolate bitters and a lemon twist.
Dude, that is like all in and so very Irish.
And it's pretty freaking good too.
Well, as for me, folks, I've got some Powers Irish whiskey, which this is supposed to be. I mean, it's a 12-year-old Irish whiskey, which it's supposed to be one of the best. And what I did in deference to your orange, Aaron, because when you told me about the orange last week, I had no idea.
Yeah, most people don't. Yeah.
What I did is I decided to mix my Irish whiskey with some orange liqueur. So I've got my Catholic and my Protestant in a glass, and on top of that, many of you don't know that I am 1/4 Scotch Irish, but I'm also a quarter Nigerian. So I have on a green dashiki.
I love it.
So that's it, Aaron. So what are we talking about today, man?
Yeah, so you and I were talking last week, and I don't remember how we got on the topic, but it's something that I've thought a lot about over the years, and I don't think we've ever talked about it on this program. Maybe we have, but I don't think we have.
Mm-hmm.
And that is justice, and specifically restorative justice versus punitive justice.
Mm.
And so, just to set it up, so people understand the differences, basically. And I'm trying to decide if I want to start this with civil life or religious life. Let's start with civil. So for the most part, our criminal justice system is set up on a model of punitive justice.
Yeah.
And punitive justice is going to focus on the perpetrator. And it's really based on, I guess you could say, a form of revenge, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is someone goes out and commits a crime. Let's say, well, obviously, if there's a crime, there's a victim of the crime. The emphasis of the justice system goes on the perpetrator, not the victim. And justice is dealt out based on punishment.
Yep.
So someone goes out to hurt someone else. We're going to focus on the person who caused the harm, and we're going to try to punish them in proportion to the harm that was done to the other person. So in other words, we're going to try to do harm to the perpetrator that will measure out in some form of equality to the harm that's done to the victim. So I like to call it punishment for punishment's sake, right?
Yep.
In a religious context, the whole model of hell is based on punitive justice. You didn't get it right. You committed too many sins. You didn't believe the right things. You didn't get your history lesson right about Jesus or who Jesus was or whatever. And so you're punished to hell for the sake of punishment. It's just punishment for the sake of punishment. So that's punitive justice. Restorative justice tends to focus more on the victim. And the idea is that there is restoration or repair that's made to the victim. So the focus is on repairing the harm done to the victim rather than punishing the perpetrator. Now, obviously, there are certain crimes that can't be restored. If you take someone's life, that can't be restored. If you're a family of someone whose life was taken, that can never be restored to you. But let's use a different example. Simple example would be theft, right?
Yeah.
If there is someone goes out and they steal $100,000 from you, then the emphasis would not go so much on the criminal and punishing the criminal, but the emphasis would go on restoring the harm that was done to the victim. So there would be restitution in this case, right? $100,000, maybe with interest or whatever, returned from the perpetrator to the victim. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated with other kinds of crime, but let's take sexual assault, right? We'll kind of hit the big three: murder, theft, sexual assault.
Yep.
I forget what the statistics are of the number of people who've been victims of sexual assault, but it's extremely high. And so the emphasis would go on, again, the victim. Now, that's not to say the perpetrator shouldn't also be punished. I'm not saying that. I don't want to set up a false dichotomy, because that'll break down pretty quickly on us.
Yep.
But instead of hundreds of thousands of dollars going into a criminal trial, treatment for the sex offender. I mean, think about this. Someone commits a sex offense and they automatically go into treatment. And the victim usually has to go out and pay for their own counseling.
Wow.
In a restorative justice instance, we would focus on repairing the psychological, mental, emotional, physical damage if there's medical bills and stuff like that.
Yep.
The system would focus more on that and bringing recovery and restoration and healing to the victim rather than just punishment. And in this case, it's really weird when you think about it, punishment and treatment for the sex offender. And I know people who had items stolen from them, you know, in break-ins or whatever. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, they don't get their stuff back for months because it's evidence, it's evidentiary. So it's sitting in an evidence locker somewhere.
Yep.
And I even know of a case where they never got it back at all because so much of the focus was put on the punishment and punishing the perpetrator. So that kind of sets up the basics, as I see it, between punitive justice and restorative justice.
You know, and this is funny because how I got my start in as a newspaper columnist and as a radio talk show host was because someone stole my car. I bought a brand new Honda Accord in 1990, and I didn't have it a week. I mean, the 30-day tags were still on it, and somebody stole my car. And what was funny was my neighbor was a night shift, or she was an evening shift nurse, and so she had just got off work and had just got in the house. And as soon as she gets in the house, she said she poured herself a drink, and she hears a noise outside. And as two kids, they were both 15, they stole my car. And my car was actually featured on Cops.
Oh my God.
Because these guys took the Virginia Beach and Chesapeake, Virginia cops on a high-speed chase. It speeds up to 130 miles an hour. My brand new car. And eventually they lost control over it and flipped it in a ditch in the highway.
Wow.
So you talk about evidence, you know, I didn't get my car back for a month because it was evidence. You know, it couldn't even get, and then once I got it back, then it was like another 2 weeks to get it fixed, which was funny because normally that kind of accident would total a car. But because Hondas has such a great resale value, they fixed it.
Wow.
And but anyway, long story short was, you know, we had a court date because they had caught the guy, and then before the court date, while this kid is out on bail or whatever, right, he steals another car, and this time he has an accident that he winds up hospitalized.
Oh my
God! And
goodness.
they say he has brain damage.
Wow.
So I'm in court, you know, and basically the attorney for this kid is a public defender. He said, hey, you know, my client has been, you know, mentally impaired by this accident. He has no understanding of what he did, and so on and so forth. And I'm thinking to myself, there has to be something. And so my lashing out was to write an op-ed piece that was in the Virginian Pilot. And this was such a big deal that, number one, there was a newspaper that asked me to write a column for them. And then number two, then I was a guest on a radio talk show. So that was where I got the radio bug. So it was like a lot of good came from this. But here was the thing, that at that particular time, I was a very conservative Republican. And so I was like, drop the hammer on this kid, lock him away for a few years so he'll understand. But now I look back on it, and I said, okay, I got my car back. I got it fixed. I was inconvenienced, but at the end of the day, I wasn't permanently harmed by that. And so I look back into the history of this kid, and he had been in the foster system, in and out of the foster system, had been abused, and a bunch of other stuff. And I'm not saying this to excuse what he did, but it's like I learned this years later that this is what he went through. And I thought to myself, I said, if somebody had loved this kid and had been there for him, maybe he wouldn't have gone out and stolen cars, right? And so when we talk, like my first inclination was to punitive justice. I wanted him to suffer for what he did, right? But years later, I find out some other things, and I say, maybe he could have worked to pay off my deductible or something like that, and in the meantime, maybe gotten some help, some psychological help. Anyway, one like when we talk about punitive justice, it always asks, okay, what laws have been broken? Who did it? And what punishment does the person deserve, right? But restorative justice says who's been hurt, what are their needs, who should fix what went wrong, right? And then the restorative says also, how do we prevent this from happening again?
Right.
And so again, I used to be geared more toward the punitive side of things. Now, again, to go back to your big three, right? Murder, sexual assault, theft, right? You can't pay anyone back for a life, right? Now, I've really soured on the death penalty in this part of my life, in this season of my life. So I'm not, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I'm not down for that. And then when it comes to sexual assault, like I used to always say, and I don't mean to make light of sexual assault, but I used to always say that if somebody committed a sexual assault, you should put them in a pen with a bunch of sexual effectors and let them get death by bunga bunga, right? But even that, but you can't restore. There's no way you can restore a sexual trauma, right? So for like murder, sexual assault, there has to be some punitive measure,
right?
And I think that's necessary to maintain the order of society.
Yeah.
But when you start talking about theft, well, okay, should you lock thieves up with violent offenders? Because then when you start talking about punitive justice for them, you run the risk of making them better criminals, or making them more, more of whatever it is that caused them to exhibit criminal behavior. So you can't. I'm kind of at the point where the only time that you should have punitive justice is when life is taken, or someone's body has been violated. Short of that, I think that everything else should be restorative. And that's my thought.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that that's why I said at the beginning, I think there is a place for punitive. But, you know, it's just one of these things. You sit back and you think about it, and I'm not pretending to have all the answers here, but how many systems in our society are just broken? I mean, why can't we just admit that so many systems are broken and they're not working for people? And the justice system, the prison system, the correction system, it doesn't appear to be working. And I think there is some recognition. So from friends that I have that work in corrections or work in the prisons, and that's cottage industry here where I live. I live 15 miles from Supermax, where
Ted Kaczynski.
Yeah, Ted Kaczynski. I forget the latest. El Chapo, maybe, you know, like
Yeah,
it's just
Chapo was there, yeah.
John Gotti was there, you know, all the big name, high profile guys. And then most of our state penitentiaries are in that same region. So it's kind of a cottage industry here. And at least in Colorado, from what I've been told, sort of some of this restorative ideas have crept into the system, but it's really a Band-Aid, or if I can use a scripture verse, it's putting a new patch on an old garment or putting new wine in old wineskins. Because, like, for example, I was told, you know, they can no longer refer to the population there as inmates. They have to call them clients. And they're trying to just throw money at mental health in these institutions to try to rehab criminals, right? And there are some people that they're beyond rehab. I mean, that's almost a scientific fact in psychology at this point. You know, if you are a true psychopath, studies show you're not going to rehabilitate, you know. But not everybody that's in prison is a psychopath. So it would just be interesting if we rethought, instead of just, you know, cages and lock them up and manage the population and then just throw money at it and change. Oh, we don't call them inmates anymore. We call them clients, which is what we call people in the mental health field that we work with. Like, what difference does that make? You know, like that's really all that did was, you know, piss off a lot of the officers and stuff. I don't know. I just wonder if we rethought the whole thing and had more resources available for the victims. So, like I mentioned earlier, if someone is a victim of sexual assault, or if they're a victim of someone in their family got murdered, then there is strong support systems financially in place to assist those families as much as possible, right?
Yep.
Hypothetical situation, the primary breadwinner in the family gets killed. Well, there should be some kind of insurance or compensation that goes towards the family, right?
Yeah.
But also, like you said, I mean, the rate of recidivism, which means people returning to prison after they've been out, is huge. You know, when I went through some training a few years ago, it was in the high 80s, low 90% here in Colorado. And so, yeah, you lock them up. You know, some of the inmates would refer to the Supermax prison, part of it. So there's different parts of the Supermax. There's what they call the Martha Stewart prison.
Yeah.
Which is for all the white people. I mean, all the white collar criminals.
No, he didn't.
Well, and then there's the Supermax, which is you're locked down 23 and a half hours a day. And that's where your really high profile people like the ones I mentioned go. And then you have another maximum security part of it. That's what they call gladiator school, which is where they take maybe like leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood, leaders of the Black Hand, leaders of the Crips and the Bloods, and they just kind of all throw them together. And they refer to that as gladiator school, right?
Yeah. And
so the education that people often end up getting in crime is how to commit more crime.
Yep. Better criminals.
And I don't know what all the answers are, but it just seems to me that there is a better way to do this. And also, you know, not all crime is committed by sociopaths or psychopaths. Some crime is just a byproduct, a natural byproduct of poverty.
Yeah.
And that doesn't just mean, you know, like stealing. I'm not just talking about stealing for your family. I'm talking about being under tons of pressure
Yeah.
because of your financial concerns and worries. Maybe that causes you to use more alcohol. Maybe you use more alcohol and get behind a wheel. Maybe you know, that's part of what's going on with the drug trafficking. Although I know there are high-end people that use drugs too. So don't, you know, I kind of want to tiptoe around this because it's very complicated and very nuanced. But I don't know. It just seems like, you know, with some of these systems, the medical system in our country, we should just start the fuck over.
Yeah.
The corrections, we should just start the fuck over. Police departments, we should just start the fuck over.
Yep.
And anyway.
Well, no, you know, like there are a couple of things, right? One is that I read a statistic that the largest mental health provider or largest network of mental health providers is the prison system. You know,
Yeah.
that a lot of people who just simply suffer from some mental imbalance, chemical or environmental or whatever, they wind up in the criminal justice system, and the criminal justice system winds up, and they don't treat them, they just warehouse them, right? So that's one thing, right? And then the other thing is that the increased privatization of prisons, and this gets back to what you were saying about calling them clients instead of inmates, and there's a reason for that, because see, when you're an inmate, you are a ward of the state. In other words, the state takes responsibility for you as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
But a client is someone who is being served by an organization. And so this is the other thing, is that I read another statistic that it costs $100,000 per person per year to house an inmate at Rikers Island in New York. Imagine what you could do with $100,000 per person per year. I mean, you could honestly, for $100,000 per person per year, we're in the territory of universal basic income.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just right there. We are also in the neighborhood of universal health care or free college education. There are so many more things that produce a greater ROI. But the problem is that the privatization of the prison system has made punitive justice a profit center.
Yep. Exactly.
And because it's a profit center, you know, this is something that I learned, that basically schools, the public school system, they keep statistics on kids, you know, from the time they start school, kindergarten, to the time they graduate, 12th grade. And they said that by the time kids reach the second grade, they have enough data points to know how many prisons need to be built. In other words, the prison system is predicated upon how many misbehaving kids there are. So they're able to project how many prisons need to be built, and also, this is another thing too. A lot of people don't know this, is that there is in punitive justice, there is a political agenda to this, because when they're doing apportioning for representatives in Congress, they count the prisoners even though the prisoners can't vote.
Interesting.
And because of that, you'll find that almost all prisons, almost all private prisons, are located in predominantly Republican districts.
Interesting.
So they're able to apportion more representatives in those areas based on the prisoners. And this goes back all the way back to Black people being 3/5 of a person and Native Americans not counted at all. It goes all the way back to that. And then when man, there's so many ways I could go with this, but like I'm gonna say this and I'll stop here. That the 13th Amendment basically allows for slavery to continue if a person is convicted of a crime. Yep. So that means that now I can put you in the criminal justice system and demand free to little cost labor from you as a punishment for your crime. So again, when we're talking about punitive justice versus restorative justice, and I'm at the point now, Aaron, where I say that if you are a thief or you are a vandal, or anything that's like nonviolent, property crimes, money crimes, things like that, as long as it's not of a personal nature, I don't even think that those people should be incarcerated.
Right.
You can put them on house arrest, put a tether on them so that you know where they are or whatever. But I think that it does society a disservice to say that, okay, we're going to spend $100,000 a year per individual to lock this fucker up. That just doesn't make any sense. And so the other thing too is like what the difference between punitive justice and restorative justice is that we talk about accountability, right? So accountability in punitive justice says I have to accept the punishment or the consequences, right? But restorative justice says I'm demonstrating empathy for the victim and helping to repair the harm done. Mm-hmm. How do we? So here's the thing: that in order to reconcile punitive justice versus restorative justice, first of all, we have to say, okay, first of all, what crimes merit punishment?
Right.
And those crimes that merit punishment, let's make sure that the punishment is adequate, that it's fair, that and that it does what it's supposed to do, and then also that if it's punitive, that during their incarceration that there is some rehabilitation that takes place, and also that you don't mix the population in such a way that you produce better criminals, because that's what the criminal justice system does now. And so again, when we start talking about conservative versus liberal, it's like conservatives say punish. I don't care what it is. Do the crime, do the time, right? But is that always the answer? And I would say that the answer is no.
Yeah, clearly, just punishing the wrongdoer isn't working. And you're talking about is it $100,000 a year?
$100,000 per person per year.
Yeah, but that doesn't count all the court costs. That doesn't count the public defender and a lot of cases. That doesn't count the judge. That doesn't count.
No, we're just talking about the cost of warehousing.
I know. So, I guess, gosh, what if you took those resources and really put that money towards solving the problem, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's poverty, whether it's education, whether it's treatment. And again, bringing the focus back to the victims and taking care of the victims, I think is super important. If there's anything, like, why can't we focus on the victim, right? I was part of a jury trial where I watched a woman who had been attacked simply get re-traumatized on the stand because she had to recount all the various details of her trauma in order to testify against the criminal. Think about that. Like, the criminal is front and center, the perpetrator is front and center, and here we're re-traumatizing the victim because the focus is on the perpetrator, right? And he ended up getting off anyway, which is a story for another day. I think I told you about it, but I don't know, man. So let's take this in a different direction.
Before you take it in a different direction, I want to throw something out there because the restorative justice can go horribly wrong, and I'm going to give you an example, right?
Yeah.
And in the state of Texas, right? In the state of Texas, they have a victims fund, and you say, okay, that's great, some money for the victims, right? So what this is a burial fund for the victims of violent crime, right? So everybody in Texas they have a loved one who is the victim of a violent crime and they die, they can get $5,000 from the state of Texas to bury their loved one. Now, you say, okay, that's great, except the fastest growing small business in Texas are mortuaries. And before you say, wow, Derrick, that's really phenomenal, let me share something else with you. That the biggest operator of funeral homes and cemeteries in America, Service Corporation of America, is located where? In Houston, Texas.
Wow.
So don't think that these people don't have a lobby in the state legislature in Texas to help get these victim funds. And so what happens is there's no incentive to stop homicides because this money is being paid out and it supports the funeral home industry. I'm gonna tell you, I have a lot of friends who are in the funeral home business, and I'm not knocking them. What they do is a ministry in the strictest sense of the word, right? But when you have the state basically subsidizing this and not creating any programs to stop it, what you're doing is you're creating a fund for the establishment or the growth of a particular industry. That's what I had to say. Now you can take it in another direction.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, maybe there are no answers because any answer you throw out, you've got human beings, and greed and whatever ultimately seems to win the day. But another aspect of restorative justice, before I bring up what I was going to bring up, in some thought leaders' minds, and I don't know how this would work out or how this would play out, but in certain circumstances, they bring the victim and the perpetrator together for the perpetrator to make amends. And I don't know enough about it, so I probably shouldn't even have brought it up, but I remember I watched a documentary on it, and these, of course, they're going to cherry pick for their documentary, but in the instances that they did show, the perpetrator was more remorseful. Sometimes there's just not a human being on the other end of our actions, right? Like, and that can be as simple as somebody's checking you out. I mean, the checker at Walmart or the grocery store, and you just treat them terrible because they made a mistake or you had to wait, or your waiter or waitress or whatever. It's like, that's not a human being there. It's just somebody that's providing a service, right? And so oftentimes with people that commit crime, there's not a human being that's there. And so the idea with this aspect of restorative justice is you bring the victim and the perpetrator together so that the perpetrator can understand, get a clearer picture that this was a human being that they harmed and this is the harm that was done. And it can lead to more remorse and change on behalf of the person who perpetrated the crime, right? And so there's this attempt at sort of reconciliation. Now, I don't know how that works when the crimes are violent. Certainly your situation you were talking about with the car, I could see how that might have been beneficial, right? Yeah. If you could get if you could get the victim to consent to that, you would have had a chance to get to know a little bit more about this young man, and he would have had a chance to realize, oh, I didn't just steal a car. There's a person behind that that's, suffered from that. So there's that idea. And then there's also this idea, and this is where it gets political and controversial and racial. Because what about restorative justice in terms of systemic evils that have been perpetrated? I was talking to a friend of mine this week who is we have to get her on the program, but she's a scholar and her passions are civil rights, politics, and religion, and the intersection of those three things. And she's one of these people that she can quote Federalist papers like a preacher can quote chapter and verse. You know what I mean? Yeah. She knows her shit. And we were talking about civil rights in America, and she's like, you think it was just the average white man or white person who put together the Constitution and how the forefathers were really thinking? They were, from my understanding, they were aristocrats. They were the top of the top. And a lot of what they were doing in the government that they were building to ensure the enrichment of themselves and their seed.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
Yep.
And so generation after generation after generation has been victimized by the system and the way it's been set up. So how do we as a society look at restorative justice for systemic evils that have been perpetrated on certain people groups? You mentioned, of course, African Americans, Native Americans. So do we want to open that can of worms or not?
No, absolutely. And let me say this, right, that a hot topic in this country is reparations, right? Yep. And there's a precedent for reparations. The Japanese Americans that were interred during World War II, they were paid $75,000 per person by the federal government. Now, this was like back in 1950, which is a huge sum of money, you know, by today's standards. So there's that precedent, and then the Germans paid the families of Holocaust victims. I think it was like the equivalent of $100,000 per person back in 1950, which is a huge sum of money. So, and people will say, okay, well, reparations, you know, they'll say, well, Aaron, Derrick, you know, you're talking about the difference between punitive and restorative. And you'll say, and some people will say, well, that's clearly punitive. And on top of that, I had nothing to do with it. You know, I have a friend who is from Ukraine, and he was the first of his immigrant parents' children born here on American soil. So he says, Derrick, I had nothing to do with slavery. I had nothing to do with the trading of human beings as capital. But I told him, my man, you benefited from it. Whether you participated in it or not, you know, if you're Eastern European or you're a Nordic person, you know, like for example, the state of Minnesota is largely populated by Scandinavian people who received land grants from the United States government to populate these areas.
Right.
Right. This was never extended to Black Americans or to Native Americans. So the question then, and Condoleezza Rice has said this best. She said that slavery and the racism that brought it on was America's birth defect. And just like a hair lip or a cleft palate, that if it's not treated, mm-hmm. it creates problems down the road. And so where we are now, we're dealing with these situations that stem from problems that were never addressed. They were never fixed. And the funny thing is, people say, oh, well, you know, Lincoln freed the slaves. You know, we gave the Indians reservations. and casinos.
And reparations.
Yeah.
You know, native people, if they can trace their lineage or whatever, they can get money from the federal government every month.
Yeah. I mean, a free college education, no taxes.
Yeah.
You know, so there are things that come from that. So what I'm saying is that sometimes there's a juxtaposition of restorative and punitive, right? And so the question is it one or is it the other? Yeah, it's both. You know, it's basically it's the Schrodinger's cat of justice, right? It's dead and it's alive. Yeah. It's punitive, it's restorative. Yeah. It's both at the same time. But I think that, like, to your point, you said, do we want to open this can of worms? Absolutely, because I think that when you look at this, like, if you want to restore, or to use a biblical term, repair the breach. If you want to repair the breach, then you have to apply some balm of Gilead, something there that actually heals the wound, not just bandages it up, covers it up, you know, because it's unattractive. No, it actually has to be treated. So when we talk about, you know, punitive versus restorative justice, we have to say, okay, that there are cases where justice must be served, and that the line between punitive and restorative may be blurred, but that should not impede the justice itself.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so admittedly, economics, especially macroeconomics, is not my wheelhouse at all. And I could be totally wrong because I don't know what I don't know. But I don't think it takes a genius to see, like, this is what bothers me. So I remember when the pandemic, when they ordered everybody to go home, close their businesses, not work, all that stuff, unless you were essential personnel. Just prior to that, like maybe a month prior to that, the oil prices tanked. I mean, stocks, Chevron, Exxon, Conoco, they tanked. And the government jumped in and stabilized that part of the economy with hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, right? I can't remember what it was. There was no drawn out congressional vote. There was no arguing on the Senate floor. They just did it. Same thing with this Silicon Valley Bank, right? That we've seen. This is what's so crazy. Like, we're going to raise interest rates on everybody because that's going to bring inflation down. And so the idea is we're going to create a credit crisis so that people can't afford to buy homes at those prices. They can't afford to buy cars at those prices. They can't afford consumer credit card debt at those prices. So that's going to force companies and the real estate market and all that stuff to come down, right? That's, at least that's the way I understand it.
Yep.
Well, as I understand it, the Silicon Valley Bank failed because of the feds raising the interest rates.
Yeah.
So you create a credit event which is designed to happen by raising interest rates, and then immediately, probably because we're coming up on an election year, the government steps in and bails everybody out.
Yep.
And yet, when they told everybody you got to stay home, and there was no, again, my point with SVB, there was no congressional hearings, there was no arguing on the Senate floor, there was no, this has to go to the president. They just stepped in and did it.
Yep.
And yet, when they tell the average American that they have to stay home, that's one of the things that's so sad about the pandemic, was that it benefited the privileged. In this sense, if you could stay home, if you were in a socioeconomic bracket, or you had a job where you already worked from home, or you had savings, or you could stay in home and work from home, or you didn't have both parents working, like, what happened to those kids? What happened to those kids where mom and dad are both essential employees and they can't go to kindergarten. They can't go to first grade, second grade, third grade.
Yep.
You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
And then we're going to take, 7-8 months or a year and a half and debate what kind of stimulus check we're going to send out to the average American. So the point I'm trying to make is the system is set up to benefit the wealthy.
Yep.
Benefit the wealthy. That's it. And why people can't see that we really can afford. So I guess what I'm saying here, Derrick, is we can afford, as the U.S. government, we can afford reparations.
Yeah.
We can afford these kinds of things that's going to improve people's lives. I mean, hell, just go into some of the inner city areas and improve the standard of living with public housing. And, and I know there's some efforts to do that, but not on the scale that we're throwing money at the industrial war complex, for example, not on the scale that we're throwing money at banks to keep them stabilized, not in the scale that we're throwing money at the stock market to make sure that, and it's not so you don't lose your 401k. It's deeper than that. But anyway, I'm kind of rambling and getting into an area that's not my expertise, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is the thing, that the whole banking situation is that, they say banks too big to fail, right? So they say that there would be an incredible human toll if these banks fail. But that's not the case. Let me tell you what would happen, because my minor in college is economics.
Mm-hmm.
So, like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, JP Morgan, they would not fail. They would simply go under the receivership of someone else, or they would consolidate, right? These banks would not fail. Now, what would happen is that a lot of people's investment would dry up, because what would happen is that a lot of debt would become uncollectible, because the entity that created the debt no longer exists, right? That in a case in point, which is not a banking thing, but General Motors, what people don't know is that the General Motors that exists today is not the General Motors that was founded in 1909 by William C. Durant. It's not the same one. They reorganized into a new corporate entity. Now, why did they do that? Because they had a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit about failed ignition switches, right? So now they reorganized so they didn't have to pay that debt. So they didn't have to pay punitive or restorative damages.
Right.
So what again, these entities would simply reorganize, but in reorganization, a lot of the debt that they own now would no longer exist. So what would happen is that a lot of Americans would get free homes, free cars, forgiven credit card debt. And the question is that a bad thing? Is that a bad thing?
Right.
And I would say the answer is no, because what that does is that tilts the table back in the favor of the average guy instead of the institutional investor.
Right.
But the thing is that to go back to your point about America, there's a documentary, and if you guys have never seen it, I highly recommend it. It's called Requiem for the American Dream, and it's a documentary that basically chronicles some talking points by Noam Chomsky, and basically he talks about how James Madison, one of the founding fathers, he wrote in the it was either the Federalist or Anti-Federalist, I don't remember now, but he wrote that basically the wealthy, the country is best served under the control of the wealthy. That was what he wrote. That's what he believed. Right. So when you look at, okay, what's going on in the country now, like this Silicon Valley Bank, and then cascading down to New Republic Bank, and then this is going on in Europe. Credit Suisse, which is one of the biggest banks in Europe,
Yeah.
is insolvent, and the Saudis had to step up with a cash infusion to prop them up. Um, what this is doing is protecting the interests of the well-heeled,
Right.
protecting the interests of the wealthy, and so again, this is not basically what this is tantamount to, Aaron, is it is punitive to the working class
Exactly.
and poor in America, but it's restorative to the wealthy.
Exactly.
And so the scales of justice then are not in balance. And the truth of the matter is that in this country, those scales have never been balanced.
Right.
However, there, like, and again, man, I hate this because like the last couple of shows, man, we've kind of gone into this biblical thing, but it's like the Bible is clear about unjust balances, unjust weights, right? And so if these scales are out of balance, there has to be a reckoning. There has to be a reconciliation. There has to be something to balance the scales out. There has to be something restorative. Because if there isn't, then justice is not being served.
Right.
And that's where we are now. There basically the justice system, and I'll say this and I'm gonna shut up, but the justice system is geared toward the wealthy. And so I had this conversation with a friend of mine, and we're gonna have him on as a guest also. He's a retired police officer, but and I explained to him why I don't think all cops are racist. I don't. I think there are some good people that are police officers.
Right.
But I think all police departments are racist. And I stand by that because the reason why police departments exist, they were an outgrowth of the slave patrols of the mid 1800s, right? That they developed the forensic techniques of investigation to track down slaves, and this grew into the modern police department. And then the other thing is that the police departments do not exist to protect people from crimes against one another. They exist to protect property and property owners against losing their property or damage to their property. That's why they exist. So then if you are poor and you don't own property, then that means that you have no real protection.
Yeah.
And so justice for you, poor person, non-property owner, is always going to be punitive. It's never going to be restorative. But for those who own property and who they are victims of property crime, there has to be a restitution, a restorative program. So again, to your point, Aaron, and I really love what you said. Maybe we need to take all of this and strip it down to the foundation and rebuild it in a way that it serves everyone equally.
Yeah. Well, since that's not going to happen, it begs the question. Sorry. Sorry.
Damn, man, you just bust my fucking bubble, man, completely.
Sorry. But I've been thinking about something. You're always driving the point to me. Make it practical. Like, what can we do? And I think, and it's good to have this discussion, I think, because I wanted to put the focus or bring into people's awareness that our justice system is built on punishment and focuses on the perpetrators. Now, because it focuses on the perpetrators more than it focuses on the victims, I would go so far as to say, and there are a lot of people in the police department that are friends of mine, a lot of people in law enforcement that I know, and I love you for the job that you do. So I'm not talking about any individuals. I'm talking about the system. The system exists. I don't think it exists even to protect and serve at all. It exists to find and punish.
Yeah.
To find, pursue, and punish. And so when we realize you got a banking system that's against you, you got a political system that's against you, you got a justice system that's not really wired to get justice for the victims. I don't believe it is at all, really. I don't think the justice system's wired at all or built at all to get justice for the victims. So then the question becomes, how do we navigate these things? How do we live? And I think it's important to be aware of this stuff. But I'll just be honest. I've told my children, like, the school system compared to the school that I grew up in. Now, I grew up in rural America. Everybody kind of knew everybody. Everybody was neighbors. And yeah, we got our ass beat, with the paddle in grade school or whatever, if we got in a fight or, whatever. But now, something that would have gotten us a spanking, now they're calling the cops on your kids. Like, it's not a learning opportunity anymore, or it's insane. And so I've already told my children, listen, if the principals interrogate you about something, ask you about something, and especially if the resource officer is there, you don't say a damn word. You tell them, I'm not going to talk to you. I have a right to legal representation, and I'll talk to you when my parents can get a lawyer here or an attorney here.
Yep.
And they have to stop. Otherwise, anything else after that is inadmissible, because they're not necessarily wired to really get to the truth or wired to get justice for people. I mean, this idea, anybody out there that's naive enough to think, if you're accused of a crime that you did not commit, if you think for 1 second the truth is just going to be on your side and you can talk, and if you just tell them the truth, that ain't how it works. It just doesn't work like, we see in Hollywood. Too many people have been convicted wrongfully of murders, even put on death row. And then DNA evidence shows up, once we get access to DNA technologies, DNA evidence vindicates them that they weren't the perpetrator at all.
Yeah.
But they're convicted on statements that they gave to the police department before their attorneys were involved. So I hate to be like that. I want my kids to know that, if they need a police officer because of an emergency, they can access that service. You know what I'm saying? Somebody's breaking into your house or something, call 911, that kind of thing. That's great. But beyond that, I don't trust them, man. I don't trust the system. And it's not that I don't trust the individual officers. I just don't trust the whole system because I don't think they care. And by they, I'm speaking of this like collective entity. I don't think they care who they throw in jail. I think they just feel like they're doing their job. And I don't know. You might have different thoughts on that, Derrick. But
no, I'm tracking with you. Like we went through a thing where in the second grade, Ducey had a couple of issues. One was that there was a little girl that he liked, and he ran up to her and kissed her on the cheek and ran away. We used to do shit like that all the time when we were kids. Yeah. They tried to bring sexual assault
they'll do
charges against him. And I told them, I said, listen, if you want to go down this road, we can. I said, I will tie your ass up in court for years. And when it's all over and done with, I'm going to own your ass. I said, or you could chalk this one up to kids on the playground. That's your choice. And because they understood that I understood the system, and because I lawyered up. Yep. And when I went in with my attorney, this is what happened. Now, another incident was my son and a little Latino boy there were some kids that they would always try to bully them. And so I had a system that I used to uh, implement with my kids. That if you're faced with a difficult situation, number one, think your way out of it. Number two, talk your way out of it. Number three, walk away from it. Number four, run away from it. And number five, engage. If you engage, finish it. Right?
Yeah.
Now, here's what happened. These kids that were bullying my son and this Latino boy, they started throwing rocks at him. And so Ducey had a moment and he said, enough is enough. And he went and handled it. And so again, they called the police and they're talking about assault charges. So I went in again, I'm lawyered up and I said, if you want to pursue this, I will tie your ass in court for years. And at the end, I'm going to own your ass. And you're going to owe me a lot of money. And if you want to go down this path, we can. But I would, what I would say is you chalk this up to a playground indiscretion and move on. So they did that. And at that point, my wife and I, we made the decision that we're not going, we took our kids out. And for 4 years, we homeschooled.
Yeah.
Because I was like, you're not going to use my kids for your prison formulation.
Yeah.
You're not going to engage my kids in the criminal justice system. You're not going to do that. Right. And I made that perfectly clear to them. Now, when one of the things is that people, the criminal justice system has been made so complex and arcane that it's impossible to understand for the average person. I mean, for the layman, unless you're lawyered up. Now, see, for me, in my case, I was a special kind of badass because number one, I know the law, and number two, I have an attorney and I got enough money to throw at it.
Right.
Right. Not everybody has that. That they don't have that luxury.
Right.
But again, what they were trying to do was trying to impress a form of punitive justice.
Right.
On children.
Right.
What does this do? What does this do? It acclimatizes the child to being involved in this criminal justice system.
It does.
Which I think is absolutely fucking wrong.
Yeah, I agree.
That and I think that anytime that we're dealing with children, and again, unless it involves a legitimate sexual assault or a legitimate homicide or assault, that we should err on the side of restorative justice.
Yeah.
And repair the breach between find out from what caused the child to do this action, and what do we need to do to fix this so that not only does this child not do it anymore, but that other children don't repeat that behavior, and that we look at the child that is harmed and we say, okay, what do we do to fix that so that this child now feels secure and understands that the system will protect them that when they are under duress.
Yeah. Yeah. Good discussion. I'm going to have to get my Irish ass to a party with my wife and her coworkers. So lots of great comments. Lots and lots of great comments. Michelle Brown. I just wanted to mention Michelle Brown. She talks about transparently, and here's some ways that she's been affected by crime, including murder. and really appreciate you sharing that, Michelle. Maybe we should have put I'm not saying, Michelle, you got triggered, but I'm just thinking maybe we should have put a trigger warning on this one, because people who have really suffered in these ways, it could stir a lot of stuff up in them.
And here's the thing, Michelle. Let me say this about Michelle. Michelle is kind of the she has a hand in the origin of Freeology Friday.
Oh, awesome!
Because this began as a conference call ministry.
Okay.
There was part of the 3-chord strand, which Michelle and Tony Calloway founded, right?
Okay.
And so that's where this began, like I want to say 8 years ago. But you've been involved in it for like the last 3 years.
Yeah.
Which is no longer ministry. It's now more, well, it's still a ministry sort of, because we're serving people.
Right.
But Michelle is one of my oldest Facebook friends, and she's awesome, and she's a survivor. She's been through some shit.
Sounds like it.
That's really amazing. I mean, really incredible. But she has survived and is thriving. So Michelle, I love you, sis, and thank you for joining in today. I want to. I don't get a chance to tell you how grateful I am for you, but Aaron and I would not be here today in this forum if it weren't for the thing that you and Tony have put together.
Wow, that's great to know. That's great to know. Hey, I hate to rush off, but I'm going to have to bail on you guys.
No problem, man. We knew that coming in, but enjoy your time, drink lots of green beer, and and get an Uber. Don't try to drive.
No, I'm smarter than that. How bad would that be to do this thing on law enforcement and all that stuff, punitive justice, and then, former pastor arrested for DUI? Oh my God! Could you imagine?
But before you go, a couple of things I want to throw out here. Number one, if Thursday nights, make sure you check out Jimmy Ligon. He does the Unreligious Facebook Live, and it's really good. I've got to go back and watch his. Yesterday, I was so swamped with work that I didn't get a chance to watch. But make sure you check that out. Aaron is on Sunday mornings. What time are you on, Aaron? Sunday?
Noon Eastern time, 12 p.m. Eastern time.
12 p.m. Eastern time. Make sure that you're watching Aaron, because he unpacks spirituality, mysticism, and metaphysics in a way that it's undeniably practical. And so that I salute you on that. The Forward podcast, which Forward Live, I do that either before or after Aaron, but not at the same time as Aaron. That time is kind of floating. I need to get that nailed down. And then Sundays at 7 p.m. Eastern, be sure to check out Live with Ben Urban and Daryl Carlson, because their show last week was just absolutely on fire, and I caught it live, so that was really cool. And what else? Oh, a couple of things. On the 31st, March 31st, we're going to be joined by Daryl Rivers, who is also a former pastor, and he's also a former police officer, and now a motivational speaker and teacher. And you don't want to miss that. Daryl is like, we're both from Detroit. We've both been in the Navy. We're both in Spec Ops, and you're just going to absolutely love him. And I talked to Henry Harris this afternoon, and I told Henry, I said, okay, the 24th, well, actually, it's actually the 24th would be. So I'm working on trying to get Henry for next Friday.
Awesome.
That's the deal. So anyway, that I had to put all of that out, get all of that out. But Aaron, love you, man. Have a great time. You and Julie have fun, dance a lot, drink a lot, and have a fucking good time, man.
All right. Thanks, man.
All right.
Peace, everybody.
All right. Oh, wait a minute. You got to close us.
Thanks for coming to our TED Talk. Hope it was helpful for you. Hope it made you think. Peace and hair grease.
There we go.
Bye, everybody.
All right.